That's far too much about me. Thank you very much, Norma. And thank you very much, Mark and Robin, for hosting this event. Well, you've had your fun from David, and now you've got me. When I started to think about cultural diplomacy, I harken back to my own experience. And actually, I still, every semester, I teach a seminar on international business culture, because at the heart of everything I did in business, certainly in the last 20 years, it was around about how does the culture of that business develop, and how does the culture of that business contribute fully to its stakeholders. And so I still try to propagate that, and I've tried to apply some of the logic that I've used in that in this. Now you'll see I've given this talk quite a complicated title: When Context is Lost, Values Clash, Risks of Social Atomization, which I think points back to David. But actually, I really wanted to counterpoint what could come across slightly as a pessimistic speech with a different title, which was 76 Trombones. But you'll have to agree with the end whether or not which of those titles was appropriate. Because my talk starts before the digital age really took off. The year that the Berlin Wall fell was perhaps the moment when 24-hour television news came into its own. In the UK, particularly, at least. It was 1989, as some of you will remember, some are too young, and round-the-clock TV news reportage started to creep in and was very much setting the scene, building excitement image by image as the peaceful revolution unfolded. Now, I was at Oxford University at the time on a 3-month sabbatical from work and participating in an international academic program. One of a couple of Britons, the other 20 members of this cadre coming from all over the world. Now, as an aside, the whole fellowship was organised by a British, avowedly Maoist academic who still managed to maintain his feud with New Delhi over his interpretation of the Sino-Indian War of 1962. No cultural diplomat was he. But, and you can imagine his politics led to some quite heated discussions, not least with the 2 Indian participants in the programme. But in general, the seminars that he organised were lively and they were fun. And as part of the programme, the newly installed London editor of the US-based Rolling News Network came up. It was relatively new in the UK, and he was there as our guest. His network had stepped up during the febrile demolishing of Berlin's wall and used events to claim its place in the growing news pantheon. We sat respectfully and listened as our guest sang out the virtues of his endeavour. As he reached his climax, he delivered what I thought was his coup de grace. What we do, he said, is show people the pictures and let them draw their own conclusions. Now, for me, this felt like a closing door moment, the beginning of the end of context. Pictures without context, facts without attribution, assertions without reference, gradually creating acceptance that the primary proof required for any event or any fact is personal belief. And of course, that was just the beginning, because TV and print journalism were soon to be joined by the foghorn amplification of social media, which is what we have today. Now, there's a phrase that's often interested me. It's conviction politics. She was a conviction politician, an obituary may declare. What fascinates me is it is often regarded as better for a politician to have been wrong, but sticking to their convictions, rather than to have been right by taking note of consensus and bending with the wind. Indeed, such unbending people often construct their self-worth based on the intensity of their conviction, irrespective of how right or worthwhile their efforts might actually be. This ignores the notion that listening and seeking context are actually positive core political values. Consensus building seems to be a dwindling fashion. Perhaps this is because most prominent so-called conviction politicians often seem most convincing, because of course they've spent a lot of time convincing themselves before they start presenting what they believe to be their unique truth. Today's context-light, information environment is a sweet spot for conviction politicians. But there's more. An additional danger is fragmentation. And I fear we are in danger of socially atomizing, and this refers back to a point David just made. This is epitomized, for me, by the billions of photographs stored in land-based compounds. Euphemistically, they're called clouds. Some of the photos in these clouds are groups, but a huge proportion are of individuals, people alone. Often, the purpose of these self-portraits is to get attention, to stand out, whether through an original selfie or a clever animation or whatever. Each one is an effort at definition. That's at the micro level. If, however, we pan out to macro scale, far from creating meaningful definition, what we're seeing is a massive increase in social entropy. People divide and divide again into ever smaller and often opposing subgroups of subgroups, each seeking variance from the other. What we see in the big picture is ever smaller granularity, what I would call human beige. Billions of people floating in their own truths, located in their own worlds. And I feel we're at an inflection point around that. Kant argued that humans are, quote, self-conscious creatures, not simply absorbed in our current passing state of consciousness. Now, I interpret this as people being rooted in context, that this self-consciousness is necessary to allow the creation of meaningful social networks and institutions. And it seems to me that we're losing this self-consciousness, as I just defined it. And if we let go of a sense of external grounding, if we free ourselves from the context of where we are and what is around us, we are surrendering that self-consciousness and forfeiting the cohesion by which society has been organized. What this fragmentation increasingly delivers is leaderless crowds, swarms. We saw it, we've seen it lots of times. You can look at, I think the first time it really came home to me was the Gilets jaunes in 2018, but of course it preceded that as well. Thank you so much. And we see it at the personal level, pylons going on to people when they've so-called stepped out of line. And we see social flashes at a local level, which David referred to just now. Excuse me. So what I believe is that the internet has largely disintermediated many bricks and mortar high street stores. It is now cutting democratic politicians out of leadership, and we should be concerned about that. So here we are. What can we do? Fake news has been used in politics and indeed many other markets for centuries. But now, with added reach and speed and shorn of the need for context, the vacuum available for activists has rarely been so welcoming. It's not clear to me that legislating the social media companies to, quote, better police their sites will actually work. Leaving aside North Korea, China has demonstrated the most resolve to police its internet, and even given the powers they have, success is by no means guaranteed. Second, the main appetite for legislation seems at the moment to be in Europe, whilst most of the platforms are elsewhere. And the US, I think, is unlikely to mirror the European zeal in this area. But in any case, I think this approach will founder on what you could call the whack-a-mole base issue. Police one side, and the pushers of misinformation can just pop up elsewhere. So, of course, legislative efforts should continue, but I don't think we should bank on them being at all successful. So, without doubt, the situation that faces us challenges Democrats, and it challenges liberals. That's a small L, not a big L. I will dwell briefly on how this might be embraced. I'm in danger of wading further out of my depth than I already am, but a very wise colleague steered me in the direction of Isaiah Berlin. For many, Berlin's writings on liberty and pluralism are key to supporting an open society. It's impossible to summarize his brilliant career, but in today's context, I want to focus on one area, namely his opposition to political extremism and international fanaticism. But be careful. What he means by this might include some of us. So listen. In practice, he strongly opposed three positions. He did not believe that all genuine questions must have one and only one true answer. Neither did he believe there must be a dependable path to discovering the true answer to a question, even if it is in principle knowable. And finally, Berlin opposed the idea that true answers, when found, will necessarily be compatible with one another. And he attributed this to a misapprehension. He attributed this misapprehension to a false assumption that the universe is harmonious and coherent. I told you it was a bit pessimistic. But I think I don't have to join these dots too hard to show how those three fallacies set up by Berlin are driving cultural battles. Today, fueled by the idea that there are unique and compatible solutions, we see people fight to promote their truth, which they believe will be the only truth. At first, this might seem a Western-centric notion, I suppose, the divided US, the far right in Europe and such like, but the more I look, the more evidence suggests it's an emerging human condition everywhere, or everywhere there's at least free access to global technical platforms, possibly further opening. Now, the classic approach, of course, is to assert our values even more stridently and to rationalize that those who don't hold those values are too ignorant or too malign to understand our universal truth. Now, I suggest that one way of embracing this challenge is to work out how we use an understanding that genuine values are many and may conflict with one another. However, for Berlin, conflicts, and as I say, for Berlin, conflicts of values are intrinsic, an irremovable element in human life. He said, and quote, "These collisions of values are the essence of what they are and what we are." So it was ever thus. But perhaps it's now much easier to exploit these differences because all over the world, at local, national, and international level, people's values are seriously at odds with one another, and institutions are being eroded and eliminated. Nationally, across Europe, the hard right thrives by maximizing these differences and exacerbating conflict. Internationally, aggressive regimes use cultural differences as weapons against each other, and the effect is stark. The multilateralism that bred the United Nations, the WTO, and the WHO is fragmenting and being eroded into much smaller groups that are often bent on diametrically opposing objectives and different truths. And whilst those countries that were used to sitting at the center of these multilaterals still try to carry on as if nothing has happened, the countries who feel excluded become ever more open to the overtures of those seeking to unzip the post-1945 global design. And it's not clear to me how much understanding these nations have of how to react to the changes that are happening, and they're happening quite quickly. The phrase culture war, however, is not a helpful one. It implies the need for one idea to dominate another. And if we believe Berlin, that's probably not ultimately helpful. It's resolution rather than victory that we should be seeking. Now, you'll be surprised, you won't be surprised, that the same wise colleague who steered me to Isaiah Berlin is a scholar of conflict resolution. And his work is focused on situations of long-standing community violence. Moving from power politics found during the Cold War, conflict resolution has, as you know, been applied in Northern Ireland, Rwanda, and other places with complex cultural situations. So with this in mind, I respectfully suggest that cultural diplomacy needs to kit ourselves up fully with the tools of conflict resolution. And I'm sure many of you are already using these tools, whether implicitly or explicitly, but I think we have to start the process of applying these tools before the conflict happens, to get to the root of the problem before it becomes an intractable problem. And so I want to highlight 3 techniques that we could increasingly systematically apply before the cultural tensions seriously erupt. One option is to make 2 related presumptions: that interests and conflicts of interest are increasingly socially constructed, and they are malleable, and that it is possible for groups to redefine their interests to reduce intergroup tension and suspicion, to reduce intergroup tension and suspicion, and to make peaceful settlements more possible. Second option is to systematically put in place structures, organizations, and institutions that establish and strengthen channels for accommodating conflicting interests. I think we've seen many of these structures eroded locally in our communities, at a national level and at an international level. We have to actually consciously seek to reinvent these institutions. They may not be the same, but I would say that many of them need to be physical as well as digital. The process of meeting people. David talked about free movement. At every single point in the Brexit legislation, I had a motion down that reinstated free movement because I saw it as the single biggest loss from the process of Brexit. And I think that's an institutional thing that we've lost to deal with the issue. And the third strategy is to seek to create a new context for the management of conflicting cultures, working across the piece to reframe key issues. I don't know what that new focus is. I think you will probably have a much better idea. So, what has all this got to do with trombones, I hear you ask? Well, I'm going to close with a rather ancient cultural reference that many of you will either be too young or missed it. So I have apologies for that, but I feel it's so relevant, I'm going to use it anyway. Because I'm reminded of Harold Hill in the Broadway hit and the film, The Music Man. In the story, Hill arrives in a rural American town and persuades the residents, the innocent residents, to pay up front for musical instruments that he has no way of delivering. He does so by inspiring the parents with the image of their children playing in a marvelous band. To the townsfolk, he paints a picture of a wonderful future, but it turns out that none of his promises are grounded in any possibility of delivery. And yet, at the climax of the show, a children's band, seemingly kitted out with musical instruments, marches onto the stage with him at the front. The ambiguity of the production is from where do the children get their instruments? Most likely, or at least most likely to me, the band is an illusion caused by the collective will of the parents who still want to buy that dream, and at the same time don't want to admit that they've been foolishly deceived. And out in the front, in the lead, is Hill himself, completely absorbed in his own myth. It's my fear that we are increasingly seeing a world marching to many different versions of the Music Man's hit song, which of course was 76 trombones.
Thank you very much, Chris. I don't think you want me to start singing 76 trombones, do you?
76
trombones led the big parade. 76, etc., etc. So now, I do believe that you have set out the case for cultural diplomacy
that was my
in
intention.
politics. Okay? So hopefully you will go back to the House of Lords and tell them that you've met us and that we have a purpose and you have the need for our purpose.
I should say that although I was only asked a few weeks ago to do this, I wrote an essay to myself about 18 months ago that contained a huge part of what I talked to you today. It's been something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think it's something we absolutely do have to. I mean, the use of soft power is to some extent, we shouldn't do that because there's a perception that it's somehow below real power. And actually, cultural diplomacy is as important, if not more important, than the political version that we see today.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. But I will do my best with the rest of the Lords. You've got David tomorrow, and obviously we've got Baroness Hood in here today.
Okay, so thank you. So we haven't finished yet, Chris. If you could stay there. Are there any questions, please? Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned Brexit there. When I learned about Brexit, I thought it wouldn't happen. But Brexit did happen, and it created a turmoil or political turmoil here. So if you remove the Brexit part in the British politics, what would you think the state of British politics will be now?
Well, that's the first thing that's called a counterfactual. And the first thing you ever avoid when you're answering questions is counterfactuals. But I'll answer it in a different way, which is that the Brexit vote was absolutely a cultural vote, not a political vote. And I put money, even though I campaigned very hard for there not to be a Brexit, I put money on the vote going the way it did. And the reason I did was because I spent time in Herefordshire, in Leominster, and everywhere there, the messages I were hearing were nowhere like the messages that my metropolitan friends were telling me here. And I knew that there was an awful lot of more places like Leominster than there were London. And it was clear to me, even though the vote was close, it was clear to me that it was always going to go that way. And so the Brexit Party, and there were predecessors to it as well, tapped into and exploited and managed and led and misinformed and all the other things that I kind of allude to in my piece. So they certainly contributed fully to it. Would it have happened without them? Well, we'll never know.
Thank you, Chris. Sorry, I have one question here. Would you mind introducing yourself? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nazish. I'm from Pakistan. I'm trainee barrister. My question is, as I was listening your speech, and you said to me, we are losing self-conscious. Can you tell me, what's the main reason why people are losing self-conscious and how they can protect themselves from losing self-consciousness? And what's the immigrant, what kind of impact they are leaving on UK culture, and what is your main role to bring them together? Thank you.
Not much then. But first of all, what's driving what we see? Well, some of it's monetized. The actual social media system is basically run on the more hits you get, the more money you make, and if you're not in the money, the more friends you get, the more acclaim you, or the more, in a sense, you start to link it to your personal worth whether that's money or other things. So that's part of what's driving it. Certainly an element of the lack of policing, which I referred to, but I'm not holding. I think elements of allowing anonymity, which is a huge issue that actually would be the first thing that I would start to deal with is online anonymity. Obviously, it's got lots of bugbears in terms of how you run it, but at the moment it's completely easy for anybody to be anybody. Where is it going and what we've got to do? I think it's about all of us having to say, now is the time to do something. And whether it's at a local level, I just came back from Ramsgate, where I had a few days in the Great British Seaside, and I was there because a friend of my wife's was launching a book, and the book was being launched in just a nascent community space. Now, the fact is that places like Ramsgate have virtually no community space, apart from actually the churches are probably the last vestige of places that offer, and to some extent mosques, but in Ramsgate it was the church. And that's the starting point. We've eroded almost everything that is a community space where people get together. And that's when you start to see your different truths. That's when you start to see your different values. And in order to get along, you start to find ways of dealing with it. And that's at an interpersonal level. At a national level, it has to be at an inter-community level. And then, of course, internationally, it's at a country level. How do we find ways of getting over the fact that we absolutely see things through different eyes? And the first thing is to admit that there are different eyes.
Totally. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Pardon. Sorry, that was not an exclamation. This is the gentleman's name. So, pardon. Your question, please.
Thank you, Lord Chris. Referring to your last statement that Brexit was more of a cultural than a political, also looking at the Scottish referendum for independence, I don't know whether you would say it's also on similar grounds, but would you feel or would you see in the future the UK going back to the EU, and would you say you would support such a move?
I think certainly we went into the last election with a 4-point plan that would start by taking us closer and eventually get us certainly back into the customs union and in free movement. It's difficult to say because both the United Kingdom and, well, the United Kingdom, the EU and the rest of the world are all moving. So it's a moving target. Will it happen very quickly? No, it won't. I really wasn't involved in the Scottish referendum, and as there's a ranking Scot looking straight at me, I wouldn't dare comment on the situation.
Thank you. So, Chris, I'm not going to ask a question. I think I will ask my question to you privately. I don't want to embarrass you.
No, it wasn't embarrassing. When I first went to Take Law, I said we have to accept the role of slavery in the formation of that company. I went there to get them to face their own realities.
Thank you.
Sorry to presume that was your question.
That was going to be my question. So, are there any more questions for Chris while we have him here? Anything?
Yes, very good looking.
That's... I was going to say, you're a long way away, and we'll refer you to his comment about spectacles.
So, Chris, thank you very, very much. Thank you.